Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today I'm really excited because I am reviewing this guy right here, the DS1522 Plus, which is Synology's new starter 10 gigabit NAS. This is the cheapest NAS that Synology sells that is 10 gigabit capable. And we're going to talk about some of the limitations on it and some of the restrictions and things like that. But this guy right here is 10 gig capable, which replaces the DS1621 Plus, which used to be the cheapest 10 gig model. And so we're going to be taking an in-depth look at this, and I'm going to be talking about who this NAS is for, and also is it worth it. And in my summary of it is, honestly, this is a great unit. I have been very impressed by the performance of this thing. A lot of people when it came out were complaining that it's got a dual core CPU, but I'll be honest with you, those dual cores ran circles around a lot of other CPUs, and I've got some testing that I've actually done on 3 different NASs, including this one, for different performance comparisons. It is a really solid 5-bay unit, and I think a lot of businesses, this would be a really great starting place. Alright, quick interjection to this video. I forgot to start the video out by saying, Synology sent me this unit for free. I have to ship it back. They don't get to see any of these videos ahead of time. This is as unbiased as I can be. But Synology did send this to me for free after I asked, and they will pay for their and return shipping, but I do have to send it back. All right, now back to the video. All right, so let's first start off by talking about the specs of this thing. So this right here is a 5-bay unit, and it is the units that don't press into lock, but instead just kind of pull out. The same thing as the 920 Plus and all of those. That is the same type of trays here. I mean, I guess it's probably better for the push lock ones that are on the 1621 Plus, but honestly, hardly there. And so it's got 5 bays internally, and then technically can be expanded out to a total of 15 bays, as it's got 2 expansion ports here on the back. I would treat this thing as a 5-bay unit, honestly, though, unless it's a nice to have where it's like, okay, I really need more storage. I don't need to buy a whole new NAS. But the expansion unit's like $400, $500. I can't quite remember. And so it ends up being like probably just cheaper to buy a new NAS and sell this one if you do need more bays a lot of the time. But it is a 5-bay unit that includes 2 M.2 NVMe SSD slots down here for NVMe SSD caching. Now, one thing to note on that is, and this is just true for every Synology in the lineup, is Synology does not allow you to make an NVMe volume. You cannot use those 2 ports to make one super fast NVMe volume. No, it has to be used for read-write caching or read caching, but you're not able to just make a volume just on the SSDs, the NVMe SSDs down there at least. Then on the front here, USB port, and on the back is where it's interesting. So on the back, we've got 4 gigabit ports right here, and we've got this little expansion slot right there that houses a new proprietary PCIe 10 gig card as an optional add-on for this that Synology makes. Now, I'm going to talk about that here in a minute, but that makes it 10 gig capable, which I love. 10 gig really can speed up your NAS if you need that, and that card also supports 2.5 and 5 gig as well. If you want to just upgrade to a smaller standard, you just need a little bit more performance, you can do that. Though I will note, it is only available as of right now, and I think probably forever, in an RJ45 format, aka 10G base T. Now, I wish it was available in a SFP Plus format because I really like for clients to be able to buy one of those Netgear switches. It's the specific one that I always buy for a lot of clients until it goes out of stock because of the pandemic, where it essentially has one SFP Plus port on there and then a bunch of like 2.5 and 5 gig uplinks. And so that allows you to have a 10 gig uplink from your NAS, which is probably where everybody's going if you're on a small network. And so that way you don't have to pay for a very expensive RJ45 10 gig switch. And it can be a lot cheaper. I get why they don't have it. I don't know if they sell a ton of them. And honestly, staying away from SFP Plus, if you don't really know what you're doing, is probably best for a lot of people. I've had a lot of people make mistakes, and it can be a huge mess if you don't really know what you're doing because there are 2 standards kind of. But I do wish they had the option. Then there's also another USB port back there, and then the 2 expansion slots. Pretty basic overall. The unit itself actually ships with 8 gigs of ECC RAM in a single channel mode. So this can be upgraded up to 32 gigs with 2 16 gig DIMMs, but it comes with an 8 gig DIMM, which is absolutely wild to me because the 1621 Plus comes with 4 gigs. And I don't know why they do that. I'm very happy about it. Now, just because it has 8 gigs of RAM does not automatically mean that you're going to completely notice that it's way faster than a 4 gig unit. Not really. There are some workflows though, especially on specifically a busy file server, where 8 gigs can really pay off over 4 gigs. And so definitely them adding it is really nice, especially considering how if you're going to run a virtual machine, you probably are going to be dedicating at least a couple of gigs to that. And so it's nice to have some overhead. And so because they put 8 gigs in this thing, you have to imagine that like the DS1623 Plus and the DS1823 Plus, those kind of like large good home lab units, have got to be shipping with at least 8 gigs of RAM, I assume. But it is upgradable to a total of 32 gigs, which is probably overkill considering how you're not going to be running a ton of virtual machines on this thing. And I mean, it will help some performance, but that's overkill. Probably the sweet spot is like maybe 16 gigs. Past there, you're not going to notice much of a difference. And then finally, it does come with a beefy external power supply, which I don't love. I get it because it is a smaller unit. I mean, there's not a ton of volume in there that they could stick a power supply, considering how the hard drives take up a large portion of the overall unit. I still do really prefer internal power supplies. They're just cleaner to work with, and they tend to be of better quality. Now, it's not horrible, but it's a beefy unit. All right, and so with that, we've pretty much touched on all the main specs except for the CPU. The CPU was, for some reason, quite controversial, though from my testing, I just think that people have a notion that number of cores automatically means performance when it doesn't. So this comes with an AMD Ryzen embedded R1600, which is a unit that there's not been a ton of testing on, so I wasn't able to get like clean external benchmarks of how good that CPU was. But it is a dual core CPU that is, let's see the specs on this thing. And so yeah, it's a dual core, but it's clocked decently fast base of 2.6. I actually think in DSM it actually showed us 2.8, so I'm surprised by that. And it turbos to 3.1. And just from looking, it's got a max TDP of about 25 watts. I think that's in turbo mode from the AMD spec sheet. So it's a pretty solid unit, but it does not come with QuickSync or AMD's version. And so because of that, Plex is not going to be able to use hardware transcoding, specifically GPU-based hardware transcoding on this device because there's no embedded GPU in it. And so for Plex users who, one, actually pay for a Plex Pass, and two, have the ability to use hardware transcoding, you actually have the correct video formats for that, and you use that often, you're not going to be able to use hardware transcoding. So I actually have a Plex box that I've set up, and I'm planning on doing a video on this in the future, that uses an Intel QuickSync GPU, which is basically embedded into the CPU itself, and it is able to transcode. If you get the video format that can be transcoded, it can transcode very quickly compared to just CPU-based transcoding. And so for users who their entire life is Plex and really focusing on transcoding, then this might not necessarily be the unit for you, though there are some pretty cheap ways to add on for about maybe 120 bucks, and I will be doing a video on that. But overall, if you do not look at Plex, I'm gonna have an entirely dedicated video for Plex on this unit where I do in-depth testing. It performs really, really well. All right, so now before we get to the raw performance of everything, I wanna talk about like the overall fan noise. There is none. It is a dead silent unit pretty much. Your hard drives are going to be the loud part of this unit. In quiet mode, which in my experience with Synology is enough to cool the drives and keeps everything fine, unless you're using some crazy massive high performance drives that are designed for server rooms. This is not going to require you to go anywhere above quiet, and it just keeps everything completely silent effectively. It'd be fine on your desk next to you. The thing that will annoy you are the hard drive noises far before the fan noises on the actual unit. And so about as quiet as it can possibly get. The testing I did with this was with 4 Seagate Iron Wolf drives that are all 4 terabytes, and I set them up in a RAID 0 array just for testing purposes. There technically is going to be a little bit better performance out of 4 drives in a RAID 0 array than 5 drives in a RAID 5 array because of the fact that it doesn't have to do any parity math. So there is that asterisk on this overall, but I wouldn't worry about too much. But I wanted to point that out for testing purposes. And finally, it also does come with a dedicated encryption in the CPU. And so that encryption instruction accelerates reading and writing to an encrypted share. And in my experience in the past, it pretty much makes it so there's no performance difference in between writing to an encrypted or a non-encrypted share. And then the last thing before we go into the full performance, because I know people are going to ask about it, is what kind of drives you need to use with this thing. And so I've got a dedicated video coming out for this, but you read right here, if you go into the notes section on any of these drives and it says this statement right here, compatible drive type indicates drives have been tested, blah, 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 blah. That means that they're going to recommend you certain drives, but if you throw in whatever drives you want, unless they're specifically on the not compatibility list, and the not compatible list is really just for drives that are actually tested in the real world and cause issues for some reason, it's not going to bark at you. It's going to give you one message and that's it. It's not going to be the whole lockdown where it's always saying warning and all that stuff. No, it's just going to work. And if we look at the drive compatibility list, we can see that we've got pretty much most drives. Though it is kind of funny, I swear they do this on purpose. Actually, I almost certainly know they do this on purpose. They always make sure that their drives are the largest available. It's quite petty. I am sure if you put a 16 terabyte Iron Wolf or an 18 or a 20 in here, it would be fine. But they really just like to be petty and not put any drive bigger than their own unless it's a surveillance drive. That's just petty. So the maximum officially supported Iron Wolf drive is 14 terabytes. But once again, this is not one of the lockdown units that actually really enforces that. It'll just flash a warning when you're actually building the volume for the very first time. And then from there, it'll be all green, all good. All right, and so now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the performance of this CPU. Because everybody said in the comments below of my first initial video, like, why would you get a dual core? Why would they put a dual core CPU in here? And I think there's a lot of misconception about number of cores versus performance. Overall, this AMD CPU has proven to be very, very, very performant. Overall, just from my own testing and just feeling around DSM, and also actually on some in-depth tests that I did. Really, a NAS does not need that much horsepower, and so a dual core CPU that's got 4 threads that's clocked as fast as this one, and has the architecture of the AMD units, means you really do not need to be looking at the number of cores and the clock and all that stuff. Instead, you actually need to look at how it works when it's integrated into a system. And so that's the performance numbers I'm about to show you here and where it's actually in the system. And so the testing I did was on 3 Synology NASs, and they are the only 3 Synology NASs in my house. And so one unfortunate caveat to this is the units I'm comparing against are older units. I'm comparing it against a DS1522 Plus and a DS920 Plus. So these are older units, but I did save off all the images, and this will be my going forward standardized test for every single NAS that comes through here. And so in the future, we will have an entire history of all these different things. And I did benchmark them to things that I think a lot of consumers will actually have, such as iPhone videos, iPhone photos, 4K videos, very specific things that other people can use to recreate themselves and do their own testing on. But for now, unfortunately, I am comparing against some older units. And so when this thing runs circles around them, it is not like it's running circles around the most up-to-date thing. Though I will say, the fact that it is running circles around these things means that that dual-core CPU is not really holding it back. Because in all honesty, the DS1819 Plus that I use as my daily NAS never really feels slow. And so it's not like it's a huge issue. And so I will say this thing is fast. All right, so now let's go ahead and open up that testing that I did. So right here is the testing that I went and did. And I went for standardizing it for things that you will actually have, specifically photos. So Synology Photos is definitely the thing on a NAS that requires the most amount of CPU, is when you're dragging photos in for the very first time, rendering those JPEG previews that are small enough to be loaded in cache on your device and not take up a ton of bandwidth when you're trying to just scroll through images, is by far the thing on the NAS that takes the most amount of CPU other than Plex. I am still working on my dedicated Plex setup for this, so that's not in this. There will be a dedicated video for this device once I have the specific media I want to use. And if you have any recommendations for video files, specifically like I really want to look at codecs, resolution, and where you're transcoding to, So if you've got any recommendations for that, please put that down in the comments below, because I really want to standardize this thing going forward, where I can keep a history and say this, and I can show all the different NASs I've tested and see where everything stands. So if you've got recommendations for codecs as well as frame rates and resolutions that you think most people would cover, I'm looking for probably 4 different video file formats that really can be used to show the whole gambit. Please put those down in the description below. But this is essentially my performance testing for Synology photos. Essentially what we did is we've got 4 different options here that should cover pretty much the whole gamut of things you will be ingesting into your NAS. We went for 250 high resolution JPEG images. So these are at least 12 megapixels that are very fine quality. These are out of a DSLR, exports out of Lightroom, very high quality. And so it's not like your little iPhone shots. Then 100 iPhone images. And then these are in the HEIC format. And I chose this specifically because it is tough on a CPU, as you can see here. Then I got 10 different video files that all totaled 2 minutes in length, that were all HEVC, so H.265 4K iPhone videos. And then finally, I took one of my videos and chopped down to 1.5 minutes of 4K, and this is 4K like 4096 by 2308, something around there, of H.264 video. And so those are the 4 things I chose to test against on every single one of these NASs going forward. The way it would work is I would open up them in SMB, I would open up photos in SMB, drag the files in, and hit start on my stopwatch. And once the progress bar was done, I would then stop the timer, and that would be how long it took. And as you can see, the CPU in this absolutely blew away the other 2 units. They are older, but these are also quad core. Both of these are quad core Intel CPUs, and the performance was pretty much across the board over twice as fast. This absolutely ran circles around these devices, and I will definitely say that it is a very fast CPU, even though it's only got 2 cores. It also does have 4 threads, so they are fighting with the same amount of threads here too. Overall, the most interesting result came down to the video category, because the DS920 Plus has actually an Intel QuickSync GPU. So that is a CPU that actually has Intel QuickSync, which should be better at encoding and decoding video. But it actually did not have any kind of performance help at all. I actually added in the H.264 video just to test the QuickSync, but it seems like Synology Photos does not use QuickSync. Or maybe it is, maybe it's not the right format, but this is just pretty much a standard H.264 codec. So not sure about that, but you can see across the board, the tests on the DS1522 Plus absolutely blew out of the water the other 2 units. They're older, but I think we can safely say that it is going to perform very easily as a photo NAS. If that's really your focus and you want to have all your photos on there and you're tired of long render times, this is going to perform really well. I wish I had had this test with the Synology DS1621 Plus, which does have a much more beefy AMD CPU, but I didn't. All right, and so now that is the photo testing. So that is going to be pretty much my standardized test for most units from now on, except I am going to be adding on that Plex section. The next thing I tested was the Blackmagic disk speed test, and this is under a burst mode. So write speeds were around 790, 780. They would tend to dip after a little bit, so I did see them drop as low as 700 if I did a sustained test. But the read speeds were really fast. This right here is a bit of a special one because it was reading right after the file was there, and so the files were already probably cached in RAM. And so this was on the higher end of tests, but sustained, I got 850, 900 pretty consistently, just reading off the disks. Now, that being said, maybe that drops a little bit when you've got 5 drives in a RAID 5 array. Maybe, I don't think so. But I think that this is actually faster than what Synology said it would be. Synology said that it planned to have read-write speeds of, let's see here, about ballpark, I guess. But it's over what Synology promised, and that was with jumbo frames turned on and the 10 gig card in the back there. And so overall, I do think that this unit is a 10 gig unit. I think that you are going to be able to read and write files very quickly to it, And I think there's a lot of value in the ability to upgrade to 10 gig for people. Even if you don't use all of 10 gig, 2.5 gig is quite nice. Though, unfortunately, you're not gonna be able to get a cheap 2.5 gig card to throw in here because there's only the one card that works in here, which is Synology's. All right, and so now to close out this video, let's talk about value for money. And so I think easily, if you're looking at the 1520 Plus, this absolutely blows that out of the water considering how they're at the same price. Definitely a great upgrade, and I'm glad they didn't even increase the price. So now what we have to compare it against is the DS1621 Plus. It is the next cheapest 10 gig capable unit, and it's a 6-bay. So the CPU in that DS1621 Plus, it's powerful. So while this unit was only able to hardly saturate a 10 gig connection, the DS1621 Plus that I tested was able to saturate 2 10 gig connections if you had everything in the disk and it was in the cache. So if you load that thing up with SSDs, easily saturating 2 10 gig connections really easily. Very impressed by that. Plus you get the flexibility to buy a cheaper add-in card and get SFP Plus, dual port, everything like that. So the DS1621 Plus is a better unit by far. But it only comes with 4 gigs of RAM, not a huge value breaker, but the fact that this comes with 8 gigs is quite nice. And so the question is, should you buy this unit or just go all the way up to the 1621 Plus? And that is tough to say. I think it really comes down to what are you using the NAS for? If you just want a unit that is going to be a 10 gig file server, and that's all you really need, you just need faster than 1 gig speeds to the thing, and you're in an office and you want to be able to share files and everything like that, and you don't need more than 5 bays, I think this is great value for money. It is $700 versus $900. The add-in card is $150, but a normal add-in card for a 10 gig card is probably $100 if you want to get a good one. So reasonably, I think it's probably a very good value for money. And I do not think anybody who buys this unit is going to regret it at all. It's going to be lower power draw, quieter than the 1621 Plus. It also, for most people, is going to perform easily for all their needs. The CPU that they put in here is actually very snappy, and I really did not feel like it was restricting much of the ability of the overall system. I do think it's definitely earned its place in the lineup. For a while, I never got the 1520 unit. I just didn't get that because you're upgrading over the 920 Plus, and then it's what, for an extra bay and a significant amount of money? But now that there's this 10 gig capability of this, might be kind of the DS920 Plus killer. Or the DS922 Plus, maybe 23 if they ever get it out. I think this, for a lot of people, especially who are kind of in the home lab environment, might replace out that unit. It is $150 more expensive, assuming they keep the price of the 922 Plus the same, but you are getting the extra bay, you are getting more RAM, and the key to all of this is you are getting an upgradable unit that can go to 10 gig, which is absolutely huge. You can start with this unit, and then when you're like, man, I just need faster speeds, you can get that 10 gig card, which is huge. Now, I am really interested to see what the 922, 923 Plus unit is going to be, but unless they really put like at least 2.5 gigabit and Ethernet on there, I think this firmly has a place in the lineup. I think there's a lot of people who spending the extra $150 to go from the 922 Plus, 923 Plus to this, the 1522 Plus, I think a lot of people will have great value for that. Now, once again, this is all kind of discounting Plex, specifically people who are using hardware transcoding in Plex, but in my opinion, that's a very small subset of overall Synology users, even for Plex users. I've talked to a lot of people in the comments below who are like, oh, how do you enable hardware transcoding, and don't even really understand it because Plex just kind of makes a lot of things work. And it's not nearly as crucial as it was back in the day when a lot of video files could not even be played on a lot of different devices. Now, pretty much most devices will play an H.264 video, and so you don't need to worry about that nearly as much. But overall, my closing thoughts on this is the DS1522 Plus is a great addition to the lineup, and I'm really glad they brought down 10 gig to this device. I would have loved to have seen 2.5 gig on the back instead of 4 1 gig ports. 2.5 gig ports would have been nice, but the fact that it does have the 10 gig add-in card to a degree makes up for that. I would have loved to have seen both, but I am very glad they added in 10 gig capability, because that also allows you to do 2.5 gig as well, or 5 gig, and it just gives you a lot more flexibility in the unit, and it will last a lot longer, honestly. Because you have the ability to go faster, you now do not have to realize that 1 gig is only 125 megabytes per second, and now everything's super slow. No, you're able to upgrade to much faster speeds, which is very nice. But yeah, overall, I really like this unit. Go ahead and leave any of your things you'd like me to test on this unit, and please let me know about those Plex video formats you'd like me to check out in the comments below. And have a good one. Bye.